Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. Midnight Alpha has hit its phase 2, bringing with it a bunch of new content for players to test, but also a bunch of new class changes based on community feedback. The one of those classes, being the Mage, didn't really get the most amount of stuff this week around, and I thought that would be a pretty good class to take a closer look at in terms of overall wholesale changes they're getting in Midnight, and Mages might be the most jarring one that I've seen so far. Midnight as an expansion is looking to do a couple of streamlining things for classes, removing some overly complex mechanics or simplifying some of the gameplay and making some of the classes easier to play. And I think no other class embodies this kind of switch up from how the War Within to Midnight, the simplification of it, than the Mage specifically. A class that I fell in love with throughout my time in the alpha of War Within, but I'm now starting to really question if I may enjoy the playstyle going into Midnight. So I want to take a closer look at everything Mages are getting in terms of how the class is changing heading into the next expansion. Everything is alpha, so none of this is finalized, so everything could change in future builds, but for now, this is a snapshot of how the class is looking so far. As always, if you guys want to keep up with regular updates for Midnight Alpha, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So, as we take a look at the new talents for Mages, do be aware that Midnight is going through a number of changes. Not everything here is final, but one of the things they're looking to do with classes is to simplify them or streamline them a little bit. Though that simplification is a changing scale. Some classes are getting like slightly more streamlined, where like annoying and complicated mechanics are made easier to use, and other classes are actually just getting like dumped down to like the most basic level. Just be aware, this is still alpha. There's still going to be a lot of changes based on player feedback. But starting off, I did want to go over the hero talent changes first. Frostfire in particular is going through a large number of changes. Essentially, how Blizzard describes it is, Frostfire has way too many procs and auras for players to track whenever you play this hero spec, which is my all-time favorite for its instant casting potential. Mostly is fire, not as much as frost, but they basically wanted to enhance your spec but not overwhelm it, and the overwhelming part is really a big highlight. Some of the new talents in the right side of the row, which are new talents being added, are basically 11.2 Karesh tier set, which is going to be duality, where casting Pyroblast can proc you Glacial, casting Glacial can proc Pyre. So as fire you get frost abilities, and frost you get fire abilities. Pretty standard. The next one is Molten Chill, which is simply just going to amplify Ignite, where Frostfire spells are now going to apply Ignite for both Frost and Fire, so a little bit more Ignite value, and a dot for Fire Mages to manage more passively than anything. Then Elemental Conduit is mostly just a Comet Storm, Glacial Spike, Pyroblast, and Meteors all apply Ignite, plus Ignite critical strike damage is increased, and there's some crit damage interaction, which is kind of neat. On the left hand side, we do have some other new talents like Heat Sink, where Fire Blast and Flurry now do a Frostfire damage, and which can help proc Ignites and also hit a little bit harder. And then below that is Frostfire Infusion, which just simply allows Frostfire Bolts critical chance to be buffed up for both specs, and the damage of Frost and Fire abilities is increased. So no matter what build you're playing, it is going to be a little bit of an increase. Flash Freeze Burn is made a little bit more standard. It just simply gives you some cooldown reduction on your major combat ability, Combustion for Fire Mage specifically. Right middle, we have Dual Casting Adept talent, where Frost and Fire spells will deal additional critical strike damage, though it's of course the opposite element of like whatever you are. So Fire Mages are getting a Frost buff, Frost Mages are getting a Fire buff, on top of some baseline ability damage as well. And the capstone of Isothermic Core, where it causes you, whenever you use Meteor, to summon up a Comet Storm, and Comet Storm to call down a Meteor. But you can see a lot of these have become like very, very passive benefits, and there's not a lot that play off of random procs, except Instant Cast, Frostfire Bolts, which is still a thing. From there, we move on to the hero spec of the Spellslinger, which has always been a bit of a more of a passive option for the most part, and it continues to be passive option, though some of the new talents that got added are going to allow it to play around with resources or procs a little bit more for both Arcane and Frost. They also did end up taking some of the talents which were previously a choice note and just made them a separate talent all by itself, so it's less of a choice, but usually the one after talents that were the more picked option. The new row on the right hand side is a couple of cool options. Attune Familiar, which buffs your pet damage. This is interesting for Arcane, which has that Arcane Familiar Raven, but also for Frost, you are getting some pet gameplay in the future going forward, at least by the looks of things. Or you could always go Shift and Shards, which allows you to gain procs to conjure more splinters. Below that, we have Infused Splinters, which allows you direct damage abilities from Splinters. I have a chance to get you a proc of either Arcane Salvo for Arcane or Freezing procs for Frost, which based on your basic damage core skills. Below that is Polish Focus, where casting core skills while at 20 or more salvo or a certain amount of freezing procs allows you to refund stacks of salvo or freezing, so again more ways for you to be able to experiment and play around with your resources as Frost and Arcane. Finally, we have Sun Fury, which doesn't get too many new changes. There are some new talents sprinkled in here and there, like Ashes of Inspiration. Whenever your Phoenix expires, it grants you lesser version of Time Warp for 10 seconds, so it gives you just a bunch of haste, encouraging you to summon the Phoenix a lot more aggressively and as much as possible. On the right hand side, we have Pyrocosm talent, where damage of your base abilities can have a chance to summon a Meteorite. When that Meteorite lands, you get cooldown reduction of another spell by half a second, or potentially proc yourself Arcane Salvo procs as Arcane Mage. Below that is Spellfire Salvo, where Fire Blast cooldown reduction and Arcane Salvo stacks are increased, but also Meteorite damage is further increased by 15%. And then there's also a changed up version of Sun Fury Execution talent, which buffs up your execute damage for Fire Mage, not for Squirt, but for another ability, which we'll talk about in a second, or allows your Barrage to hit harder against enemies with a touch of the Magi as Arcane. So it's a slightly different setup that technically buffs execute for Fire, but buffs a whole completely another mechanic for Arcane specifically. Also, really quickly, I want to go over the Mage class talents because those have changed a little bit. They have gotten a couple adjustments, and you can see a lot of the familiar talents a little bit higher in the top rows, and that's pretty much most of the streamlining, allowing mages to pick up some of the core abilities they use a lot earlier in the talent tree and hopefully create some more choice nodes, though sometimes not less of choices really, towards the capstone options, but also removing some of that power from the class talent tree and giving it back to the specs a little bit more, so you have less cookie cutter builds. Some of the things to notice here is Ice Block is super high up in the talent tree. All the time defensively is also really high up as well, which is always really good. All the time does have a new upgrade talent of either Time Walk, which messes around with some cooldown reduction stuff, or Temporal Alignment. Upon dropping below 25% health, your past selves corrects the timeline, casting all the time and instantly returning 50% of your maximum health. So all the time now has an automatic heal benefit to it. So if you just want to use it and just have an automatic heal as like a precautionary defensive ability, you now can do so, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. So they're making mages a little bit easier to play. They got abilities like your Deekers, for example, a little bit easier to pick up. Some of your other utility stuff also easier to pick up, and even greater invisibility easier to pick up as well. The talent of Shimmer still makes a return. However, Shimmer no longer comes with 2 charges baseline. Baseline is only 1 charge, so you either have Blink, which takes a global cooldown but has a shorter CD and breaks you out of stuns, or you pick up Shimmer with a longer cooldown but lets you cast spells while shimmering, so you can still be mid-cast and shimmer around. So that's going to be a little bit of a different mobility adjustment, and also having it based on 1 charge is interesting as well. That's because as part of your capstones towards the bottom, you can now grant a 2nd charge to Blink or Shimmer. So Spatial Manipulation as a talent has so many different mechanics as to how it's going to affect mages for PvE or PvP. For PvE, it obviously allows you to go into Shimmer and get a 2nd charge, but now you're kind of committing a bottom tier capstone pretty much immediately. Or you could go for 2 blinks potentially, maybe go for cooldown reduction with improved blink, where that could actually be kind of good in some PvE situations, but Shimmer a lot of the times ends up being the talent the players go to for that nice feeling combination of casting while technically on the move. But for PvP, this could be huge. A 2nd charge on Blink means a mage will never, ever sit a stun ever again. Any type of crowd control, you could just get out of it immediately. Mobility is huge, cannot be rooted ever, so that's actually going to be quite consequential for mages. For PvP content specifically, it's going to be interesting to see if this talent will actually still continue and make its way all the way through alpha. As usual, alpha stuff isn't always set in stone. a lot of things are going to be changing in the future. One of the things that's going to be a pretty wild change is the fact that Mass Barrier is gone, replaced with improved barriers for all 3 specs. And it's actually a different effect for different specs. Fire gains a bigger version of the barrier damage reflection effect, but it also allows you to heal it whenever it does absorb any kind of damage. So Fire Mage is getting a little bit of healing increase. Frost Mages get physical damage reduction while barrier is active and 5% more barrier absorption based on your max health. While for Arcane Mages, they're getting less magic damage overall while the barrier holds, but also shorter harmful magic effect duration for both PvE and PvP. So mages are not going to have this like group utility benefit. You still can go for like mass invisibility if that's what you want to play, but that group utility to shield everybody, a bit less value. So mages are by default are going to be looking a little bit more selfish, not really of their own return. Though again, maybe this talent change and this whole capstone of Mass Barrier being gone, maybe that will be reverted in the future. Who knows really. Also, keen-eyed among you would notice that shifting power is gone completely. So mages no longer play around a cooldown reduction mechanic, adjusting the timer for a lot of their CDs. If there are any cooldown reduction elements to be considered, those have been offset into their class specs, but then certain abilities like Arcane Mages, Touch the Magi have some Apex talent changes, and there's a lot of Apex talent adjustments that could potentially give you either longer duration of some of those major cooldowns or possibly allow you multiple uses for you to have that flexibility. Because that is the fun part about shifting power, is the flexibility it gave your cooldowns as a mage. But yeah, shifting power itself is gone, which is going to impact your mobility buttons, your defensive buttons, your utility buttons, and of course offensive buttons as well. But they did adjust some of the cooldowns for some of those abilities, but definitely the complexity of how you play your mage and how you use shifting power in order to maximize its effectiveness and like variety of different content, that is definitely getting stripped out of the class specifically. From there, I do want to move on to the spec of Arcane Mage. Where previously this was one of the less popular specs, this has become a very popular pickup for many players, especially for endgame content. I don't think that really made Arcane Mages over time that much easier to play, but definitely a lot of players saw the power they brought and gravitated towards it naturally. So Arcane Mages are going through a number of big changes. Some of them are going to be big core adjustments, such as the talent of Arcane Salvo. Arcane Mages naturally, at least right now in War Within, have a lot of different buffs that they're gonna track that buff the ability of Arcane Barrage, such a core ability with so many different overlapping components where it is very important for you to know when to press Arcane Barrage, and depending on certain buffs and procs, that ability gotta be sent out immediately. It is such a strong skill for you for AoE content, single target raiding content, dungeons, open world, PvP. It is such a big ability, and there's so many different little buffs that can amplify it that if you're able to overlap them, you'll get the most amount of value. So they're offsetting a lot of this overlapping to a single buff of Salva that allows you on any damaging spell to increase the damage of your Arcane Barrage up until it reaches 60%, which is going to be the peak when you'll want to kind of send it before ideally that you overcap on the ability. So this is going to be where a lot of this value of damage amps reset to Arcane Salvo specifically. And it's going to be a core mechanic where a lot of the talents are also going to build off of Arcane Salvo and allow you to stack it up a little bit easier. Another thing that also happened to Arcane Mages is Arcane Explosion, while still is a spell in your spellbook, is essentially useless, even for Arcane Mages. So it is something that you'll still be able to use for mobility or in PvP, which is kind of where it's useful, but Arcane Mages are getting a brand new version of an AoE Arcane Blast called Arcane Pulse, which functions very similarly to Arcane Blast, but in an AoE format. It just does AoE damage to that target. It also does have each Arcane charge increases the damage of this ability as well, but also the mana cost too. So yeah, it is basically, yeah, our Arcane Blast, but an AoE version. So it's interesting, which allows Arcane Mages to do a lot of the AoE rotation from a distance. So there's now going to be a little bit less differences between Arcane Mage and the other mages in terms of how they do their damage. So, and there's also a bunch of talents that are there to amp up the damage of Pulse and Blast. So they're really trying to push this ability as the alternative AoE option. Some of the other things is Touch of the Magi has a new icon, which looks pretty cool. Some of the talents like Aether Attunement have been reworked, where now missiles always cleave to additional targets at half effectiveness, which used to be a proc, but now is just something that you could heavily invest into if you're looking for a missile heavy build. We also got a couple of new capstones here, such as Overflowing Insight, which increases the damage of your blast and pulse by quite a bit, but also increases the mana cost. So if you're looking to play around that mana game as an Arcane Mage, you will definitely still be able to do so. But if you enjoy the Orb-based gameplay, they got you a new talent called Orb Mastery, where casting Arcane Orb while you have Clear Casting active now consumes Clear Casting and causes it to fire 2 additional arcane orbs at 100% effectiveness. So if you're a big fan of orb-based gameplay, you can now replace missiles with orbs in terms of your AoE damage, which can be pretty good. And the fact that orbs generate you a bunch of resources and do damage, potentially building up the damage of arcane salvo, you could be sending out an orb into a big barrage with salvo, getting a proc of clear casting, and then kind of just continue to chain those over and over and over. Right now, Arcane Mages are doing some really wacky stuff over on the alpha, and the potential for this talent could be huge. We also know the Mage's apex talents, with it being Touch of the Archmage, where Touch of the Magi accumulates additional damage and has 1 additional charge. So this ability is a 45-second cooldown. You can now have a little bit more flexibility of when you use it again. That's pretty awesome. Touch of the Archmage as well is also there. Arcane charges further increase the damage of the Arcane Blast, Pulse, and Barrage by 15%, and that can be stacked up to 2 times. And the final trait being the where Touch of the Magi explodes, it leaves it behind a pulsing rune on its target, dealing 25% of its damage over 6 seconds to all nearby enemies, and 100% increased damage to your initial target or Touch of the Magi. So it's a very straightforward damage amp for plays around Touch of the Magi. Gives you a little bit more flexibility on how you use Touch of the Magi, but in general it should be a pretty good combination. Next we have the spec of Fire Mage, which basically is being, I guess the best way to put it is simplified down a little. I was going to use the word dumbed down a bit, but that sounds bad, so I'll just go with simplified, but you at least know where I'm coming from. Phoenix Flame essentially is gone for the spec, so you are having less abilities that can be used to instant cast, and also Fire Mages are expected to cast Fireball a lot more often. So if you like original version of Fire Mage, that's more like a turret build that stands still, casts fireballs, and they deal good damage, then you're going to be happy with this version of Fire Mage. If you're enjoying the mobile version of Fire Mage we've had previously, then you're probably going to enjoy this one a lot less. Out of some of the new talents we've gotten is going to be Flame Strike, where you have 2 versions of it, either one that can be casted on location of your cursor or location of your target. And I think the target one could be really good in some cases, because a lot of the times you're casting Flame Strike on like the enemy that's in the middle of a big trash bag, and this is, I think, is going to be super nice for that targeting apparatus specifically. Some of the other talent changes are going to be Kindling, which now has a flat cooldown reduction for the ability of Combustion, which is kind of massive. The talent of Scorch no longer buffs gives you the ability to Scorch. Instead, you don't even have Scorch anymore. Instead, Fireball will always critical strike when it damages an enemy below 30% health. So it gives Fireball some potentially big damage and crit value and consistency with its execute damage, but you gotta stand still in order to cast it. You also do have the talent of Scald, however, that buffs the damage of Fireball greatly, so potentially there could be some value from that, specifically if you invest into a heavy Fireball build. Take a look at some of the other talents. There's a lot of talents that we've seen in the past, but they just have a slightly different position within the talent tree. There are some new options that can do Capstone or Returning Capstone of Sinistrum from back in the day, so that's going to be coming back as a not a random proc. Well, actually, I guess it is a random proc because it's based off of Fire Blast and Flame Strike, 8% chance to summon a Storm of Cinders that deal damage and apply Ignite. We also have a choice note of Slow Burn versus Burn It All to adjust how your combustion works. With Slow Burn, combustion grants you mastery equal to a portion of your crit, a pretty big portion of your crit, and combustion causes your spells to apply Ignite at 15% increased effectiveness, while Burn It All is a bit more bursty. Combustion grants you 10% increased spell damage, plus an additional 20% of your critical strike chance as spell damage as well. We also have Fire Mage's Apex talent, which is Fired Up. While Combustion is active, consuming Hot Streak has a 50% chance to grant you a stack of Fired Up, increasing your fire damage by 5% until Combustion ends, and you kind of want to ramp it up as quickly as possible, because there's a bunch of benefits from it, like gaining Fired Up, reduces the cooldown of Fire Blast by 2.5 seconds, so you can use it fairly aggressively during Combustion to make it fast-paced, but also Fired Up allows you, consuming Hot Streak, has a substantially increased chance of granting you Fired Up. Additionally, Fired Up now extends your combustion duration by 1 second. So big combustion windows are still going to be at the core of a fire mage and how they play it, but the downtime outside of combustion with more fireballs, I think for some may potentially be jarring. Then we have the spec of Frost, which also has gotten through some wild new changes. They have a brand new version of Shattering called Freezing, so that's going to be the new mechanic that they'll play around with. Rotational bloat for a lot of those skills has been removed, with a lot of talents streamlined to just support a handful of skills. And also, the major cooldown of Icy Veins is gone, but also a familiar friend from back in the day does make a surprising return. So first of all, Shatter as a mechanic has changed for Frost mages because now there's two components. Damage from Frostbolt and Flurry applies freezing to the target, stacking up to 20 times. And damage from Ice Lance shatters foes, consuming all stacks of freezing in the process to do frost damage per stack. So that is going to be your main mechanic of how you deal quote-unquote burst damage as a Frost mage. You build up stacks of freezing and then you shatter it once you have a bunch of them on the target. And there's a bunch of talents in order to play around with, like Fingers of Frost, which still allows you to gain stacks of Fingers of Frost that lets your Ice Lances do additional damage and shatter without consuming those freezing stacks. So if you build up the stacks and get a bunch of Fingers of Frost procs, you can still benefit from that shatter without removing those freezing stacks all the way, which is pretty nice. We also got a new defensive choice of Cold Snap versus Glacial Bulwark. Cold Snap about the same 5-minute cooldown in order to reset a bunch of defenses, or Glacial Bulwark to give you Ice Block, an Ice Barrier, and an additional charge for you to use as you wish. So that might potentially be interesting. Ray of Frost is your major class ability. So instead of having Icy Veins that buffs you, you now have Ray of Frost that just does a boatload of damage every minute. And then what it does is does a bunch of damage and generates 8 stacks of freezing over its duration on the target. And you can further amplify it with Splintering Ray, so you can deal additional damage to nearby enemies up to 5, so a target cap ability, unfortunately. Or Ray of Frost damage itself does more damage in single target output. Like I said, a familiar friend is going to be back for Frost Mages, and it looks like Summon Water Elemental is making a return. 15-second cooldown to summon a Water Elemental to fight for you, and right now it doesn't have too many talents that amplify its damage, but there is a talent below it that may potentially make it consequential in terms of the damage that it does. But yeah, Water Elemental is back, but I just don't really know how strong it's going to be. We'll see how the tuning pans out. Also, Combat Storm is now back again, but it's also weird because now you can only proc it after casting Ray of Frost at the target. Casting Ray of Frost replaces your Blizzard with a Combat Storm, calling down a series of 7 icy comets around the target, doing damage with AoE impact, and each comet shatters 2 stacks of freezing on the target. So it does a bunch of damage, shattering all those freezing, well, little by little shattering freezing procs per hit. So if you can load up a bunch of them and then go for a big Combat Storm, that could potentially be big damage. So the fact that we won't be able to use Combat Storm as a separate cooldown in our replaces an ability is one of those things that they're doing here. They're consolidating for you to use Frostbolt, Flurry, Lance, Orb, Blizzard as like your main core skills, not really have you veer too far out of that specifically. We also have Apex talents. If you enjoy having pets, then you're gonna love Frost Mage because they get Hand of Frost. Shattering an enemy has a 10% chance to summon a Hand of Frost to pursue your target, dealing spell frost damage or spell power frost damage and applying 2 stacks of freezing on contact. So if you're a fan of like wizards in Dungeons and Dragons, or if you play Baldur's Gate, you basically get Mage Hand as a proc to summon Mage Hands that attack the enemy target. I don't really know if they're ranged or melee. Hopefully they'll be consistent, because that would be awful if they're melee and they get rooted or they can't reach the target and you not benefit for pox. So hopefully they'll solve it in the future. But yeah, the Hand of Frost basically summons more pets. The further aspect allows each stack of freezing you shatter to increase your chance to summon Hand of Frost by an additional 1%. Damage from Hand of Frost increases your spell damage by 2% for 8 seconds with multiple applications overlapping. Below that, Ray of Frost summons 4 Hands of Frost over its duration. Additionally, Ray of Frost gains an additional charge and its damage is increased by a percentage. Right now it's 1, but in the future it might change, because I doubt they'll be buffing it only by 1. But this does give you a little bit more flexibility on how you use Ray of Frost with the 30-second mini burst cooldowns that you can do with all those hands, or something you could chain back to back in order to have like a very, very powerful minute burst window. But with that being said, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy this update or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like, as it would very much appreciate it. And also feel free to join our Discord community to keep up with any future updates regarding Midnight Alpha, which will post there pretty regularly, or Legion Remix, which is live right now. And I got a couple of guys cooking in the background for that specifically. Also, let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on these mage changes? I'm actually kind of surprised just how simplified the spec is looking. It's almost kind of scary, in fact. I just always like the uniqueness and the complexity of mages that was different than every other class, the procs and things, and this might be a whole new era for mages in general. But I want to hear your thoughts. Do you like this, or do you not like these changes? In the comments. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in our next one.